Welcome to the Nonprofit Edge, a podcast series to promote purpose in practice. Each week, this webinar series features an extraordinary individual that provides valuable and impactful services, helping to transform the capabilities of their nonprofit clients. Join us as we explore a variety of topics, all vital to the success of nonprofit organizations. Learn and grow from the experience and expertise of our featured guests. Without further delay, let's introduce you to the host of the Nonprofit Edge podcast series, Chris Looney.
Hey, welcome to the Nonprofit Edge. I'm your host, Chris Looney, and today we are tackling a topic that every nonprofit leader faces at some point: strategic planning. Let's be honest, many organizations invest significant time and resources into creating a strategic plan, only to watch it gather dust on a shelf. So what separates a document from a dynamic roadmap? What makes a strategic plan truly effective? To help us unpack that question, I'm joined by Rebecca Alvarez, co-founder and principal of NP Strategies. Rebecca works alongside nonprofit leaders across the country to help them design plans that are clear, actionable, and transformative. Welcome to the show, Rebecca. We're glad to have you with us.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here.
We are very excited to jump in, and by we I mean our audience, who confronts this issue all the time and has to plan for the certainty of creating a strategic plan. And so, what I'd love to know from your experience is why so many nonprofit strategic plans fail to produce real momentum.
Yeah, so I think it can come down to a couple different reasons, but generally when I've worked with organizations that are either, underwhelmed by past strategic planning efforts or as you said, kind of struggling to build momentum, I think that what I've seen is that they've approached the planning process as wanting to answer the question, what do we have to focus on over the next couple of years, as opposed to answering the question, kind of where are we headed as an organization?
Okay.
Because I think if you ask yourself at any point in time, what do we have to focus on? What the result is often kind of a to-do list that makes sense at the point of time it was developed, but isn't really strategic and can become obsolete, right? After, when the context changes, when the environment changes. So I think most often when there's been sort of a lack of momentum coming out of a strategic plan, it's really around that I would say that the plan is not as strategic as you would want a strategic plan to be, and therefore kind of has a limited life. I think that's one of the main things. I mean, there's other reasons that I think a plan can fail to produce momentum, but that's probably the one that I see the most frequently.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I would have assumed that you'd really want that punch list of kind of tasks or areas to focus on, that would be a very important outcome of the strategic planning process. And it probably is, but it's not maybe the driver or what you will gain from maybe an inappropriately executed planning process. And with that, I'd love to know where you see the most common mistakes being made in that strategic planning process.
Plan is about looking to the future, right? A plan is about where are we going. And so if it doesn't answer that, then the list of goals, tactics, whatever, can be pretty stagnant and not gearing toward a shared direction. So I think a common pitfall would be lacking clarity of a shared direction, because if everything else in the plan has to kind of gear up toward that. And also with a shared direction, it enables an organization to be kind of agile and nimble and making course corrections and changes, as long as it's sort of the idea of a map, right? If we know we're headed to where this pin that we've stuck in over here, there can be different ways that we get there, but ultimately we know where we're going. And so I think one pitfall is kind of too much emphasis again on the what do we have to do right now, what do we have to do, as opposed to like that future orientation. I think another thing that can, where things can go wrong, is not thinking really early on about who to involve in the process, and how to involve them, right? Because plan is just a plan, and until you start executing on it, and execution is all about people and how you work together to get somewhere. And I always think of that, your culture, the trust in the organization, the how the role of the board and the role of the team, everything are all part of effective execution. And so not involving those stakeholders, and this is especially true in a nonprofit organization.
What is the failure of a plan typically in the design of it, or do you find that it's in the implementation of it?
I mean, I think it can be in both, but if it's in the design, then the execution kind of becomes a moot point, right?
Good,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah,
And
but
and with
I
a
think you
great
can
plan,
have a good plan conceptually that fails in the execution. But if the design is off, then it's gonna get you off course right from the very beginning.
yeah. And do you think organizations place enough emphasis on the execution? It seems to me from the planning processes that I've been around that there hasn't actually been much attention placed to the how we're going to effectively implement the plan. It's always been, let's get the plan done, let's announce the plan, let's make sure everyone is singing from the same hymnal with the plan. And then it's like, okay, why didn't the plan actually happen? And so is that a reality that you see?
Um, yeah, I think sometimes, but to me, the focus on the execution begins with the planning process. So I guess rather than saying is too much of the emphasis on the plan, or instead of execution, I would kind of reframe that a little bit and say that I think one of the most important things to set a plan up for success is in being really intentional about the process you're going to go through to design the plan, because that is what sets you up, I think, for successful execution. So what I mean by that is, if the focus is on, let's just, like you said, let's get the plan done, like let's just get it on paper and then we can go about doing it, then I think the organization can be really shortchanged in the shared learning that happens by going through the process together, the building alignment of different stakeholders around where we're headed, the identification and then answering of really tough questions about trade-offs the organization might have to make, or key decisions that have to be made. So if it's just about like, let's hear everyone's thoughts about what they think we should focus on, let's categorize in some ways and get the plan done so that we can focus on doing it, then I think all that learning and alignment building is kind of missed. And then it kind of has a higher likelihood of falling apart, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course it does. And do you know within the first couple of months if a plan's going to succeed or fail?
In the first couple of months of the planning process, or of once
No, I
the plan's
think
adopted?
once it's adopted, yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Um,
are you able to fairly
these are
predict? And
interesting
again,
questions, because I think because it's a lot focused on like plan failure, and I tend to spend a lot of my time thinking
it's
about
awesome.
plan success.
Touche. We'll get there, I promise. Yeah. No, that's so fair. That's interesting. And I don't mean to be so negative. And I also
No,
want to
you're
be
right, though. I
clear
mean, a lot
that
of organizations have negative experiences, and I don't want to skip
yeah, that's
over
right.
that.
That's
But
right.
but in a balance of my time, I spend a lot more time working with organizations on how to make them successful and how to set the organization up for success, and not just how to avoid
The
the issue.
pitfalls and
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
that's great. That's wonderful. And I think too that there would be this difference about whether an organization would go through a process with a consultant and an advisor and a guide like you, as opposed to those that choose to do it independently or through mechanisms that seem smart but actually don't lead to a positive outcome. So I think, obviously one of the surest ways to gain a successful outcome in this strategic planning process is to pick the right partner that can set up the process for success and assure that the implementation is going to happen as it should.
I
And
mean, I
so
think
when,
I think that's true. I would just say one thing I would add to that is that um, I'm a big believer that one size doesn't fit all, right, in terms of a planning process. And that is even true for the same organization at different points in time, right? So what an organization's planning process needs to look like at, in 2025 might be different than what they need that process to look like 3 years down the road, right? And it should kind of be designed in a way that matches where they're at.
Mhm.
So sometimes do organizations do internal planning processes that are successful? Absolutely, I'm sure. But I would say that as far as the choosing the right partner piece of it and working with someone external, one of the benefits of that is that it does enable the board, the CEO, leadership team to be a part of the process as opposed to trying to work the process, if that makes sense. So then they're able to participate in it more fully as one of the key stakeholders, and also then benefit from the learning and everything. So.
Well, if we're talking about successful plans,
Mhm.
let's kind of go through a couple of questions that I think might be helpful for organizations, maybe as they think about entering into a
Sure.
plan. And so one of them is like, what's the right number of priorities to focus on? Is there a number that's too many?
Usually I like to go through a process of kind of forced prioritization, meaning, say, well, what if you had to focus on only three things? What would it be? Right. And so in that kind of line of thinking, it sort of says, okay, somewhere around that three key priorities is a good number. But I also am realistic, and I know that organizations are complex, and so usually when I've worked with organizations on strategic plans, I would say that they end up with somewhere in the 3 to 5 range of
Mhm.
like key organizational priorities to focus on. I'm not a stickler for that number. If an organization has got to have a sixth and they can execute on that, then of course, that it has to work for the organization. But I think going into it with the line of thinking of, if we had to focus on only three top things, what would they be? It does help with that sort of forcing what are the most critical things for our organization.
Yeah, it's perfect. And are there certain accountability mechanisms or the measurement of certain things that maintain accountability? I'm trying to figure out what role accountability plays in these strategic plans.
Accountability comes out in both the strategic plan, but then also in more what I would say is on the staff driven side, more annual operational planning, right? Which links up to the strategic plan, but is at a different level of detail.
Mhm.
So as far as a strategic plan goes in terms of accountability, I think some of the key questions that it's important for a strategic plan to answer is where are we headed? What does success look like for the organization 3+ years out? Sometimes that I would call that where we headed piece, sort of the strategic vision. When I mentioned earlier the idea of kind of a pin on the map, that it's that pin, right? So where are we going? And that I think can be a little bit longer term in nature, but that's a key question that the plan answers. Then what do we have to focus on to get there, or what are the biggest priorities we have to focus on to get there? That's that like forced prioritization. What's the three top things that we have to really
Mhm.
hit the nail on the head or the ball out of the park or whatever analogy you want to use in order to get to pin on the map. So those I often end up, different. There's different vernacular for strategic plans, and again, I don't think you have to be a stickler on what's right or wrong, but just consistency with an organization, so that you can call those key priorities priorities or initiatives, and then answer, how will we know if we've been successful? And that's where, kind of at a high level, what are some of the measures that help us know if we've reached that pin on the map, right? What is it that we're holding ourselves accountable to reaching? And then in terms of accountability, there's I think a successful strategic planning process really takes a good look at what's the board's role in this strategic plan cycle at this time in the organization of helping us reach that, arrive at that pin on the map or be successful.
Right.
And that's a little bit different than it's not what's the board role, as in like generally what's the board's role and basic responsibilities of the board kind of thing, but more so at this point in time in the organization, and with this say 3-year plan that we're working on, what's the highest and best use of our board's talent, time, resources to help us be successful in this strategic plan. And I think that accountability of really naming how the board can help us achieve this plan. And then as far as the internal accountability, I think clear accountability on those initiatives, and then a process internally for how the strategic plan that is then used for annual operating plans. As how is it that on an annual basis, each department goals, financial goals, what have you, link up to that strategic plan.
That's good. And is it typically the executive director or CEO's responsibility to continually bring the plan back in front of the board, or is it something, the board should constantly be reviewing and measuring themselves against in terms of their own commitments? How do you think
I think it's a
about?
partnership. I think it should regularly be brought back in front of the board, and here's what's working, here's what's going well, here's what our key challenges are, and here's are there questions that need to be discussed for input at the board, or I think ultimately, yes, it's about reporting and accountability, but it's also the strategic plan as a tool to have strategic conversations and make decisions as an organization. So I think using the plan as a constant guide to say, this opportunity we're talking about right here, here's where it fits in our strategic plan, or does it fit? Based on if a new opportunity comes out the organization, the strategic plan is really a framework to say, is this something we should jump on right now, or is this something we should say no to, or not right now to? So I think having it front and center and a regular part of board discussion, as a way to frame what the organization is focusing on, what its wins are, what its challenges are, is really important. But I think that's done in partnership. That's the board, the CEO or executive director, as you said, and board together, really, designing those conversations. I mean, the CEO may elevate, here's something we need to talk about, and its connection to the strategic plan. If the board is not hearing that, then they absolutely ask the question. But I think it's done together, if that makes sense.
It does. And I love the concept of the plan providing a framework for decision making about what to pursue in the future, what not to pursue, what to put energy into, what not to put energy into. It seems like it could be a very helpful guide to the organization and its leadership in terms of where to put the energy and the money and the effort. And without it, it sort of is just at the whim of current leadership, or maybe someone's intuition, or their pet project, let's say. And that seems dangerous to not have that guide.
Yeah, I think I mean, if we think about how strategic plans have evolved over the last 10 years or so, or, choose your time frame, but they've certainly evolved. And I think in the past, it was more of they were more detailed documents. And I think, given the changing context that organizations operate in, and just, a real focus on wanting to be really strategic and focused on direction and where we're headed, I think more and more it's important for a strategic plan to be viewed as not a list of all the things, but as a set of priorities and a framework that we can use to guide the organizations. Have, those oftentimes then out the organizations I work with talk about guardrails, like knowing what those look like so that we can be continuously, making decisions and shaping what each year looks like as part of execution, but not being prescriptive of this is exactly what we're going to do in year one, and this is exactly what we're going to do in year two. I just don't think that kind of plan is very realistic these days.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that because I think a lot of organizations do attempt to be so prescriptive that the first kind of failure to hit a goalpost almost makes the plan seem irrelevant or something that is a lost cause. And then whatever value the rest of the strategic plan might offer is ignored. And so there's a delicate balance there. And that leads maybe into a question that I had around clarity of a well-written or well-produced strategic plan. Like how do you measure the clarity of a document or the user friendliness maybe of a document?
I mean, I think it always goes back to that, keep it simple, right? And so I think if I find in the planning process that there's not sort of the ownership of it, and you see it starting to be talked about by certainly the CEO, but beyond that, the whole leadership team, depending on the size of the organization, that might be a different number of people, but if it's really talked about and owned by the leadership team, by the board leadership in similar terms, and that there's clarity in those talking points, then I know that it's simple enough and it's clear enough that people can use it, will be able to use it as that guide. I think and that's really more like the shared understanding of it and shared ownership and how that clarity is seen. I think in terms of the document, it's again, is it simple, and does it answer those core questions of where are we headed, what are the biggest things we have to focus on to get there, how will we know if we're successful, and in X number of years, however long the plan is for. And then the other thing that I usually, to this point around balancing sort of being nimble and not prescriptive with also it being a plan that's meaningful enough that it has some meat to it. I think a lot of that comes from the process. And usually when I work with organizations on strategic planning, we focus on the where, are we clear on who we are, where we're headed, our biggest priorities. And then in that planning process, also create and what are our year one goals? What are the things we have to focus on year one of this plan in order to move those initiatives forward, or priorities, whatever we want to call them, and work toward our vision. But then it's just year one goals, right? So then they can do check-ins throughout that year one of execution, and then develop the year two goals when you're getting closer to year two. And that's how to sort of, I think, balance that there's some ability to be nimble within the plan and kind of course correct in how you get to that strategic vision, but also with enough specificity at the time that the plan is adopted with year one goals that we know, okay, here's the meat of it. Here's what we're going to get into.
Yeah, so there's this
jump right in Yeah.
overarching framework. There's some guardrails. There's some definition around year one, and then a need to iterate the plan on a go forward basis. What's the length of time that's most common these days in terms of the length of a plan? Is it 3 years, 5 years, 7, 10? I hear a lot
Yeah,
of
good question.
different, yeah, I hear a lot of different answers.
I think that the most common that is around that I work with organizations on is usually 3 year. The strategic vision part of it, which is like the pin in the map I keep referring to, that can be
Yeah.
longer term in nature.
Good.
And kind of
Yeah.
spans a couple strategic plan cycles. But
Yeah.
I think 2 to 3 years is the most common.
Good. And is it a Word document that we're talking about? Is it a PowerPoint? Like what do you prefer? Or what is the most common sort of vehicle, I guess, to deliver the plan in its final form to a board or to executive leadership team or whatever it might audience might be?
Yeah, usually when it comes to sort of presenting a plan to a board and using it as a tool to have the conversation around, it's usually in slides,
Yeah.
but as far as a final plan document, I mean, the slides can then be mirrored with a more written document. Those are often helpful. Again, I think the emphasis is on brief. Nobody wants
Yeah. Thank
a
you.
massive
Right.
binder that sits on a shelf.
Oh,
But
I've seen 100, 200 page strategic plans. So
yeah, no, I think the emphasis is on brief, but I do think a written document of the process and sort of the final agreements on where we landed with the plan is really helpful for an organization to have,
yeah.
because it's great for onboarding new board members, new staff members.
Right. Good point.
Attaching to a grant proposal. The other thing I've seen organizations do, and I've seen some really different and creative things here, is creating just a very high level summary in more of an infographic form. Sometimes I think that can be really effective, just again for that remembering, like what are the big main components of our plan, and just keeping them front and center and visualizing that. Having them in a really simple visual document can be helpful. But I think at the end of the day, it's in guiding through the process, it's just important that if it's captured in slides, it's almost, in my mind anyway, the most user friendly, because then if you have work plans and so forth, you can be updating those and tracking progress and presenting that at board meetings periodically and those kinds of things.
Yeah. Good. And it's interesting because there's so many things that an organization could focus on. In your experience, is it more heavily weighted toward mission, vision, value stuff? Is it focused on the revenue side of the equation? Is it focused on the programmatic side of the equation? Is it necessarily a blend of all three? Is there a right or wrong when it comes to what you're going to pick to focus on?
I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong. I think, again, it kind of goes back to that. It's not one size fits all. What is that organization's kind of biggest strategic questions, or is there a fork in the road that they're needing to make a big decision on? Where are they in their organization kind of history or in life cycle? All of those things kind of play into what are the things that we need to tackle together in this particular strategic planning process. So I think that the mission, vision, values stuff that you mentioned, that those really get to, those things are not really about where we headed, but about who are we, right? Who are we as an organization?
Right.
Are we clear on our identity? And so some organizations, it's pretty clear when I, have those initial conversations with them, and we're kind of mapping out what a planning process might look like. For some organizations, it's really clear that they're solid on who they are, right? Maybe they've recently gone through a process where they delved into that, and they, I've worked with organizations that have just come where they're embarking on strategic planning, and maybe they recently did a rebrand and delved very deeply into who we are, right?
Right.
So if that's the case, we don't need to redo that as part of strategic planning. We use that as a that this is who we are, and we need to any strategic direction we create then is based on that. But in other organizations, it's pretty clear that there's some different ideas about identity, and who either the who they're serving is evolving, and that's a core part of identity and mission, or their values either haven't been named, maybe they haven't gone through that as an organization yet, or they're just are experiencing some big changes, or maybe they've recently kind of merged together with another organization and are revisiting some of those things. So if those kinds of elements are at play, then absolutely we would delve into identity as part of strategic planning, because you can't set a direction if you don't know who you are, right? So I kind of view it as identity, then direction, then how we're going to get there. And as far as
Direction. Okay.
yeah, and as far as the financial question in that plays into the reality that we have in terms of the direction, right, of where we're headed, and then it also plays into the how we're going to get there. I think the financial implications of a plan, and the sort of what we are able to do, kind of balanced with what do we want to get to be able to do, is really an important part of this conversation as well. So looking at our financial reality, where do we need to, is there anything key that we need to move the needle on with regard to financial sustainability, and how does that weave into the plan, is I think embedded both in that direction and in the how we're going to get there part.
That's great. As we think about the process of creating the right strategic plan for an organization, can you kind of define the optimal role for the board?
I think it involved from the beginning. I think keeping the focus on really those questions of identity and where we headed, and not as much into the execution and how are we going to get there on, I think that there could be a danger of getting too operational. That would be one of the kind of pitfalls to avoid. But I think if it's focused on understanding our context, understanding who we are and where we're headed as an organization, and setting some of that direction together in partnership again with the leadership team, but of where we're headed, then it can really be kind of more the staff that's looking at, okay, operationally, how are we going to get there? I think the other thing that the role of the board is important is that self-reflection of, okay, what are we as a board what's our role in this, and how can we help move the organization forward? And focusing on that as well. I think in terms of, how to involve the board, strategic planning committee or whole board, and what that looks like. That's hard to answer with just I think that really comes down to each organization and
100%.
the size of their board, what's their committee structure, all those kinds of things weigh into how you specifically involve the board. But I think doing so in some way from the very beginning is key.
Yeah. And you want them involved. You want them deeply engaged. You want them invested. You want them to feel like it's their plan, but then you want to make sure that they're not micromanaging the implementation or taking the role that staff should potentially play. And I think that's a hard balance to
and it can also
find.
look really different depending on the organization's a little bit size, but I think even more so kind of their stage of development, and how boards often go through this transition of being more hands-on to more governance focused over time, or at least over organization stages of development. And so I think there's important to recognize where they're at in that regard also.
Yeah. It also strikes me that there are so many nonprofits. Take, for example, my local Little League, that is a pretty significant entity with a very substantial budget, has 0 employees.
Yeah,
So it's an
exactly.
entirely
It's gonna look totally
board-driven,
different.
volunteer-driven. Yeah.
Yeah,
And and
yeah. So
and
I guess
then
my answer, I was referring to
of
or
course.
different type of nonprofit organization.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
And I
that's
and
where we're
I
at.
I I think to your point, it's really important to not have a cookie cutter approach,
Yeah,
to be very aware of the realities of the organization in terms of staffing and size and the board makeup and all of these factors that are so different from
mhm.
one organization to another. And oftentimes we make these just general statements as if every nonprofit
Yeah,
acts the same or should be led the same or should be um, conducted a strategic planning process the same. So that's just not the truth.
absolutely. Yeah, I would say, but kind of back to one of your earlier questions when you were asking sort of pitfalls or when a plan might fail. I think that would be a good answer. If from the beginning the approach is kind of cookie cutter, like we do it this way, and is not really asking questions to understand where the organization is and defining a
Yeah.
process that works for them, then it would be kind of set up for failure. I think you were asking, I cut out a little bit, but I think you were asking what advice to give a CEO who's embarking on a planning process. Two things come to mind. One is that I think it very beginning, even in the first conversations with the board chair and leadership team, and even prior to reaching out and identifying if you're going to work with somebody externally, I think it's important to sort of take a step back and ask, are there any big strategic questions that we have right now as an organization that we want this process to help illuminate or help us answer? Are there trade-offs we need to make? Like, are we trying to determine, are we moving in this direction or that direction? And there may not be. It might be that the direction is pretty clear in the CEO's mind, and that it's more a matter of creating alignment and shared direction. But to the extent that there are big decisions to be made, trade-offs, knowing those early on, or at least identifying what you think those might be early on, really informs the type of planning process needed. And starting those conversations early is really important. So I think that would be my first piece of advice, is to take a step back and say, like, where are we right now as an organization? Do I see the road ahead, and it's about creating alignment around, toward that pin on a map? Or are there a couple of different options for where that pin gets placed on the map in terms of our strategic direction? And we really need a process that maybe involves more data gathering, and be that qualitative or quantitative to help us arrive at an answer, right? And I think that really shapes what the process will look like. The other thing I think that can help a lot, and we haven't talked too much about this, but I think that there's an element of building shared culture around the idea of what success looks like in a strategic plan, between leadership team, staff, and board is important. And what I mean by that is, if we want to how do we want this plan to be aspirational and set us on a pathway toward a desired future, or do we want this plan to be a roadmap that we just hit out of the park? And what I mean by that is, I've seen organizations sometimes be hesitant to set a more aspirational future because they feel that they have to hit 100% of the plan goals each year. And if they don't, it feels very like kind of there's a feeling of like that it's punitive. Like we have to be hitting 100% of our goals. And that's a very different thing than if there's a shared culture around, look, we've set this direction for the future. And if we get 80% of the way there in 3 years, we've done amazing. Or 90% of the way there in 3 years, we've done amazing. If it takes us 4 years to reach it, versus 3, it's still a successful plan, we're moving in the right direction, right? Those are two very different ways of looking at the plan. And I think that if we don't have some shared kind of culture around that at the beginning, the type of plan you create will look very different. If you've got some stakeholders in the room who are like, we've got to make sure that we 100% have the capacity to execute what we put in that plan, and we've got to be very realistic in that plan, versus if you have other stakeholders in their room who are like, we want to dream big, and then you have somewhere in the middle, then it can be really tricky to create a plan that you feel good about and that builds momentum. My personal feeling on it is that the way to balance it is that we should have a strategic direction that is aspirational, and if we get 90% of the way there, we've done awesome. Right, but not everyone feels that way, and if that is not the culture around the plan in the room, then it's going to be hard. So I think that's something that I would just, I think even in the very beginning stages, conversations between like a CEO or executive director and board chair around that, it helps to then set the tone with the rest of the stakeholders involved.
Yeah, such a good piece of advice to offer. Are there particular director or the CEO should absolutely own?
Partnering with the board leadership to guide the process, and working with their staff team, if their direct reports to really think through how are we, asking the tough questions, making sure that there's not the elephants in the room that aren't being addressed, right? I think the CEO's leadership in making sure that the process is approached and set up in a way that people can ask the tough questions, and that this is the time to do that, I think is a really important role for the CEO to own. And they can do that in partnership with, if they do bring in an external consultant to help guide the process, they can do that in partnership with that consultant to help prompt those questions and so forth. But I think it's important that the CEO or executive director own that they want this to be a opportunity to have the hard conversations that need to be had. Right.
Yeah. And so talk to me a little bit about the external stakeholders that need to be involved.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, this is where the extent of that process can look different depending on the organization and depending on the particular strategic planning process. So I think absolutely staff should be involved. How many staff and what that looks like is a function of that organization, their staff size, their org chart, and so forth. But I think staff involvement is key, because again, a plan is just a plan until you execute it, and buy-in and understanding and being able to speak into the plan is really important. And leveraging expertise of the staff is really important. So involving them is key, and board for sure. As far as community, I would also argue that's really important. Again, the extent of that can look different in different planning processes. Sometimes it can be, listening sessions or focus groups with different stakeholder groups. It can be one-on-one interviews with external stakeholders, community. It can involve leveraging data that the organization already has. If an organization has recently done some survey work and program evaluation and everything, then you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can leverage all of that data and information into the planning process. If that's not been done, then you may design a survey, right? So it really is, again, looking at what information does the organization already have, what sort of input gathering have they done in their community, and can that be used in strategic planning, and what new input gathering do we need to do in order to inform the planning process. So, and again, the more, back to that question of identity and whether or not that is part of the planning process, I think the more questions there are about who we are, and the more forks in the road and kind of key decisions that need to be made, then the probably more thorough and, more stakeholder input that we need to, and other types of research and data that we need in order to inform the plan.
Yeah, yeah. How do you assure that a plan is going to be aspirational enough, aggressive enough? And how do you prevent it from being so absurd in terms of its goals that it's unlikely to be attainable and almost sets the organization up for failure? I've often struggled with organizations that seem to have ambition that outstrips their mission capabilities, and sometimes the strategic plan isn't helping
Mm-hmm.
rein that in, but in some ways maybe even stretching that capability even further. So how do you guide against or create those guardrails
Yeah.
against establishing a plan that is just almost destined to fail from the beginning?
Well, so I'll tackle the like too aspirational part of that, I guess, if you're
Yeah.
like the, cloud in the sky plan, but with,
Thank you.
you know,
Yeah.
so I think some ways to protect against that. One is kind of goes back to your previous question. External stakeholder input gathering and informing the plan, not just by looking navel gazing, but by getting some outside perspectives, I think can help with that a lot. Because if an organization has, huge aspirations, but they're not very grounded in the reality of who they are today, the external stakeholder interviews are going to give you a pretty good reality check on that.
Okay.
Right. So
Good.
that's one way to, if an organization is seeing themselves as way up here, but everyone that we talk to in the process is the perception of them is very different, then I think that helps an organization understand from a different lens kind of where they are, and that can bring that aspiration back into the into the atmosphere a little bit, right? So that's one way to just control against that. That's not even about the setting the goal itself, but again, it goes back to the process and how you are collecting information to inform where you're headed. I think another way it goes back to what I was saying about what's the culture around the plan. And when I said that if we've been aspirational enough that we're stretching ourselves, but that we've done a great job if we can accomplish, get 80 or 90% of the way there. If that's the case, then you have to be able to get 80 or 90% of the way there, right?
Yeah.
And so having conversations in the planning process about capacity, that oftentimes there's the line of questioning when we're gathering staff input and board input, and others is, what are some of the organization's greatest strengths? What are some of the key challenges? And in that key challenges conversations, you'll hear about capacity constraints and those sorts of things. So that can kind of ground the organization in like, what is it that they're going to be able to execute on, as well as highlight where maybe some capacity investments are needed, even if maybe not in day one of implementation, but sometime over that plan cycle in order to be able to move the needle. So I think it's asking both the where do we want to be aspirational type questions, but grounding that with where are we today and how do we use the plan itself to help move us in the direction and bridge the gap.
Yeah, excellent. That's so helpful. So I'm interested in knowing a little bit about your views on the future of strategic planning, and I think I'm interested mostly because the environment today seems so uncertain for so many organizations. Things are changing so rapidly in so many ways. It almost feels unstable in some ways for a lot of organizations. And how can we plan for the future? We can't even know where we're going to be tomorrow, or those kinds
Mm-hmm.
of thoughts and feelings. And so I wanted to get your read on what the future of strategic planning looks like for these organizations that are doing it today or doing it in the future. I mean, are 5-year plans still even relevant? And all of those kinds of questions just pop into my head. What are your thoughts and
Yeah,
reactions to that?
Well, I think one thing is, just to your last question, is our 5-year plans even relevant? I mean, I think you can have a 5-year, and even 5-year plus in some cases direction of where you're
Thank you.
headed. But I don't think a 5-year plan is as relevant. And
Got
I
it.
don't really work with organizations on creating like a whole 5-year plan typically.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's more in the 2 to 3 year. But I think what's even more important, and what I'm seeing be increasingly important in the current environment, is again viewing that plan as a framework for decision making, and something that helps to set direction and priorities without being prescriptive. Because if it's done in that way, then by definition it's got to be a living document, right? You've got to be using it to help make decisions on an ongoing basis. You've got to be re-looking at each year what are our annual goals to work to move toward that direction. So built into that way of crafting a plan is check-ins and course changes, and being agile. So I think that within that, it also says that bigger picture clarity, yes, but without as much detail. So I think you'll see shorter plans. I think we already see that, and I think that will continue.
Yeah.
And then as
That's
far
right.
as dealing with uncertainty, to me, again, it's about the process and what kind of strategic muscle you build in the organization through the planning. I think the strategic planning process can help build that muscle, but then you have to
Right.
keep it in shape, right? Which means that you're doing check-ins, you're asking, yourselves, what's working really well, what's not, what challenges do we see coming ahead, what risks do we see down the pipe, what opportunities do we see, how do those things feed into our strategic plan, and just having a regular cycle of looking at those types of questions as a staff team and as a board together, I think will help plans just be living documents that are used as a guide, more so than as a set of action items to check off, if that makes sense.
That's great. All right, so we have one final closing question, and it's probably one that you're going to amalgamate from a lot of the answers you've already given.
Mm-hmm.
But if you could give one piece of advice to a nonprofit leader about to embark on a strategic planning process, what would that advice be?
Think through what success looks like for you from this planning process. As a leader, what do you think the biggest questions are that you'd like to answer, or where you think alignment is most needed, those types of things, and have some of those thoughts in your mind. Talk to your board chair early about what you think you want the process to look like.
Mhm.
And then think through, I think, the how you want to involve staff team. I think to me, it's about identifying what the big questions are, and then being really intentional from the beginning about how you want to involve kind of your team, because again, board and staff, because that's going to be so critical to successful execution. So that kind of goes back to something we talked about earlier on, which is that in order for it to be successful, you've got to be thinking about execution from the very beginning.
Absolutely. It's brilliant. And the shared culture piece that you talked about earlier was a helpful framing, thinking about the engagement of the C-suite team, the board, and the staff. And thank you, Rebecca, for
Yeah.
this incredibly helpful conversation. Strategic planning done well is not a luxury, it's foundational to mission success, as you well know. To the audience out there, if you're listening today and your organization is approaching a planning cycle, or perhaps struggling to activate a current plan, this conversation is your invitation to approach the process differently and probably also a good opportunity to reach out to Rebecca and see if she might be able to provide some guidance, wisdom, support to that planning process. I highly recommend Rebecca and MP Strategies to all of you out there looking to produce an excellent planning process. But thank you again, Rebecca, for sharing your wisdom with us. And to the listeners, if you found today's episode valuable, please be sure to subscribe, share it with a colleague, and continue strengthening your nonprofit edge. Thanks all. See you soon.
Thanks, Chris. Fun talking with you.
Thank you for joining us for the Nonprofit Edge, a podcast series to promote purpose in practice. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation and learned some important lessons from our featured expert. We always want our content to be informative and to position nonprofit leaders to succeed. Please join us again for our next podcast. In the meantime, we wish you all the best and encourage you to learn more about Fulcrum Nonprofit Leadership by visiting our website at www.fulcrumleader.com.